and welcome to Crowvane Manor. Wherever you are, and whatever kind of night it's been, you've come to the right place to slow down. Let the world go quiet for a while. Out here, none of it needs your attention. Many of you return to these rooms night after night, and I'm grateful for that. There's a reason you keep coming back. The stories kept inside these walls aren't quite like the ones you'll hear anywhere else. Before we begin, leave a comment and tell me where in the world you're listening from tonight. I always enjoy reading them. And if these stories stay with you, a like and a subscribe help more than you know. Now get comfortable, breathe slow, and let's open the door together. About 2 years ago, I was having dinner at an Indian restaurant with Jim, one of my closest friends. We have known each other for around 50 years. That matters because Jim is not someone I had just met or someone whose memory I would casually dismiss. We have known each other through most of our lives. There is a level of familiarity there that comes only from decades of friendship. It was a Sunday night. The restaurant was almost completely empty. In fact, as far as I remember, we were the only customers. That made the whole place feel unusually quiet. There were staff somewhere in the building, obviously, but nobody was walking around near our table. There were no other diners squeezing past us or people moving chairs around. We had our meal and talked normally. Nothing unusual happened. Eventually, we finished eating and were getting ready to leave. Before going, I decided to use the toilet. I pushed my chair back and stood up. Then I tried to walk. I could not. At first, I thought I had caught my shoe on something. Maybe the leg of the chair. Maybe part of the table. Maybe my trousers. I looked down. What I saw made no sense. The shoelaces on my right shoe had come undone. That by itself would not have been strange. Shoelaces come loose. But they had somehow been passed through the small fabric tab at the back of my left shoe. Then, they had been tied again, in a bow. My right shoe was effectively tied to the back of my left shoe. I stood there looking down, trying to understand what I was seeing. The laces had not simply tangled around my other foot. They were not caught loosely on something. They appeared to have been deliberately threaded through the tab on the other shoe and retied. That was why I could not walk. My feet were physically connected. I called Jim's attention to it. He looked. I asked whether he had done it. He had not. He had not seen anyone near my feet. Neither had I. That was the part that immediately became frightening. If someone had crawled underneath the table and tied my shoes together, surely one of us would have noticed. We were the only customers. Nobody could have approached our table without being obvious. Even if a member of staff had somehow decided to play a bizarre prank, they would have needed to bend down near my legs for long enough to untie one shoe, thread the laces through the tab on the other, and tie a bow. That is not something a person does in one invisible movement. It requires several separate actions. Find the knot. Untie it. Take the loose laces. Reach toward the other foot. Thread them through a small loop. Tie them again, all while I was sitting there. I could not understand how that could happen without me feeling something. There should have been movement against my shoe. I should have felt the laces being pulled. My feet might have shifted. Jim should have seen someone under or beside the table. But neither of us remembered anything. We just reached the end of dinner. I stood up, and suddenly my shoes were tied together. If that had happened during a different period of my life, maybe I would have found it bizarre, but funny. I might have assumed I had somehow done it accidentally. I might have blamed Jim even if he denied it. I might have spent 10 minutes trying to recreate the knot, But at the time, I was already struggling psychologically. I had been experiencing what I would describe as low-grade psychosis. And one of the beliefs I had developed was that there was a demon inside me. I understand now that this belief was part of what I was going through. I am not saying that there really was a demon. That distinction is important. But at the time, the belief felt real to me. Very real. So when I looked down and saw my shoes apparently tied together in a way I could not explain, my mind did not begin with the harmless possibilities. It went immediately to the worst one. Something was doing this to me. Something I could not see. Something that had already been occupying my thoughts and frightening me. The incident terrified me. I did not have the emotional distance to say, that is strange. Let's work it out. Instead, it felt like confirmation of something I already feared. That is one of the reasons I have thought about the event so much since then. There are really two separate questions. The first is physical. How did the laces get tied that way? The second is psychological. What did I believe it meant? I am much more cautious about the second question now. An unexplained physical event does not prove the frightening interpretation attached to it. Even if I never discover how those laces became tied together, that does not mean a demon did it. Not knowing the mechanism is not the same as knowing the cause was supernatural. At the time, though, I could not separate those ideas easily. I saw something I thought was physically impossible. I already believed something evil was attached to me. The two experiences collided. That made the whole thing much more frightening than an ordinary, unexplained incident. I have tried many times to think of how it might have happened naturally. The simplest possibility is that the laces were not tied together in quite the way I remember. Memory can become more certain after a frightening event. Maybe one lace had come undone, become caught through the heel tab of the other shoe, and then tangled into something that looked like a bow. Shoelaces are flexible. When feet move under a table, they cross. One shoe can catch another. A loose lace can pass through a loop surprisingly easily. Then movement can tighten it. Perhaps what looked like a deliberate knot was actually an accidental tangle. That is possible, but my memory is very specific. I remember seeing the lace threaded through the tab and tied, not merely wrapped. A bow. That detail is what makes it difficult to dismiss. Could a bow form accidentally? It would be unusual, but not necessarily impossible. Knots sometimes appear through repeated movement, especially with long cords. People find headphone cables tied into knots after being carried in pockets. Shoelaces twist around themselves. A loop can catch another loop and tighten. If the original bow on my right shoe had partly loosened rather than completely untied, one of the loops might have passed through the tab on the left shoe. Then, pulling my feet apart could have tightened the remaining structure into something that looked newly tied. Maybe I interpreted the final shape as someone deliberately undoing and retying the lace, when what actually happened was a partially collapsed knot getting caught. That explanation is physically possible. It also explains why I felt nothing while sitting. The movement might have happened gradually beneath the table. My feet could have crossed without me noticing. One lace catches. I shift position. The knot changes. Then I stand and discover the result. The problem is that I remember the configuration looking too deliberate. But again, I was frightened when I examined it. Fear affects perception. Once my mind decided someone tied my shoes together, every detail supported that interpretation. I was not calmly studying knot mechanics. I was panicking. Another possibility is that I had somehow done it myself without remembering. That sounds ridiculous at first. Why would I untie one shoe, thread it through the other, and retie it? But human behavior is not always fully conscious. People fidget. They adjust shoes. They cross their legs. They play with objects under tables while talking. I might have touched my shoelaces absent-mindedly during the meal. I have no memory of doing so, but lack of memory does not prove an action never occurred. When we are deeply engaged in conversation, we can perform repetitive actions without forming a clear memory. Twisting a napkin, moving a glass, adjusting clothing, picking at a label. If I had been especially distracted or psychologically unwell at the time, my attention and memory could have been less reliable than usual. It is possible I manipulated the laces myself in some unusual way and simply did not encode the moment clearly. That is uncomfortable to consider because it makes the event less externally mysterious and more connected to my own state of mind. But it is still a possibility. The fact that I was dealing with psychotic symptoms means I have to take memory and perception seriously. Again, that does not mean the shoelaces did not physically look the way I remember. Jim saw the result too. There was clearly something wrong with the shoes. But he did not witness how they got that way. Neither did I. So the cause remains open. There is also the possibility of a prank. Jim denied doing it. I believe him. After 50 years of friendship, I have a good sense of when he is joking with me. And this did not feel like something he was secretly enjoying. But even trusted friends can do stupid things. Maybe he tied them while I was distracted and later realized how badly it frightened me, so he kept denying it. I do not think that happened. Still, if I am listing normal explanations honestly, I cannot exclude it completely. The logistics would also be difficult. He would have had to reach my feet without me noticing. Depending on the table layout, that may have been nearly impossible. If he had been sitting opposite me, leaning underneath the table would have been obvious. If beside me, perhaps easier, but still not subtle, and there was no reason for him to do it. A 50-year friend playing a childish shoelace prank is not impossible, but it would be a strange choice. A member of staff doing it seems even less likely. Restaurants sometimes have employees moving around quietly, but nobody kneels under a customer's table to tie their shoes together. That would be completely inappropriate. There would also be no obvious motive. So although another person is physically possible, I do not find it especially convincing. I have wondered whether the tab on the left shoe was positioned in a way that made accidental entanglement easier than I realized. Those heel loops are designed to help pull a shoe on, and some are fairly large. If my right shoelace was long, my feet could have crossed beneath the table. A lace might pass through the loop. If the bow was loose, movement could pull part of it through. Then when I moved my legs again, the knot could tighten. By the time I stood, the two shoes were linked. This explanation requires coincidence, but coincidence happens. The strange part is that because I did not see the process, the final state looked intentional. We often judge intention from arrangement. A chair placed in the center of a room looks deliberate. A rope tied around something looks deliberate. Shoes tied together look deliberate. But physical systems can produce organized-looking results by accident. That does not make the result less strange. It just means I cannot imagine how it happened accidentally is not proof that someone or something consciously did it. I know that now. At the restaurant, none of that helped. The emotional context overwhelmed everything. I had been living with the frightening belief that there was something evil inside me. So an unexplained event happening directly to my body felt targeted. It did not happen across the room. A glass did not fall. A light did not flicker. My shoes had been physically altered while I was wearing them. That intimacy was terrifying. It felt like something had been close enough to touch me without my knowledge. I think that is what frightened me most. If a mysterious object moved across the restaurant, I could distance myself from it. This involved my feet. I had been sitting there the entire time. Whatever caused it had happened within inches of my body. At the time, I interpreted that as evidence that I was not safe even when I was with someone I trusted in a public place. That is a terrible feeling when you are already struggling psychologically. I have told people about the event since then. Most do not seem to believe me. I understand why. The story sounds impossible. A man sits in a nearly empty restaurant. He stands up. His shoelace has somehow been untied, passed through the back loop of the opposite shoe, and retied without anyone noticing. There is no obvious mechanism. It sounds like a magic trick. If someone told me the same story, I would probably start looking for the hidden normal explanation. Maybe the person misremembered. Maybe the friend did it. Maybe the shoes tangled accidentally. Those are reasonable reactions. What is difficult is that I know there really was something physically wrong with the shoes when I stood up. Jim saw that too. Whatever interpretation we make afterward, I did not simply hallucinate being unable to walk. The shoes were connected. That gives the incident a different quality from a purely visual experience. But physical evidence can exist without the interpretation being correct. A shoelace knot is evidence that a shoelace became knotted. It is not evidence of a demon. That sounds obvious when stated calmly. It did not feel obvious at the time. One thing I have learned from looking back is how dangerous it can be when an ambiguous event lands inside an already frightening belief system. The brain wants consistency. If you already believe something is following you, every unusual sound becomes part of it. If you believe something evil is inside you, every coincidence can feel like confirmation. That does not mean the coincidence did not happen. It means the meaning assigned to it can become much larger than the evidence supports. My shoelaces really were in a bizarre configuration. The belief that something demonic caused it was a separate conclusion. I try to keep those two things apart now. I've also wondered whether Jim's presence prevented the experience from becoming even worse. If I had been alone, I might later question whether the entire event happened the way I remembered. Because he was there, I know another person saw that my shoes were somehow connected. At the same time, because he did not witness the process, he cannot solve it either. He did not see anyone approach. He did not remember me playing with my shoes. He only saw the result after I pointed it out. So we share the mystery, but not an explanation. That makes the event both more reassuring and more frustrating. I am not alone in remembering that something strange happened. But there was no second pair of eyes watching the moment it happened. The restaurant being nearly empty also removed a lot of obvious explanations. If the place had been crowded, I could imagine someone brushing against me, a child crawling beneath the table, or multiple people moving close enough that I might miss something. But it was Sunday night, and we were effectively alone as customers. That quiet environment made it feel impossible that another person had physically interfered with my shoes. On the other hand, the lack of activity might also mean I was sitting in the same position for a long time. My feet could have been crossed or touching under the table for much longer than I realized. That gives accidental entanglement more time to occur. If my shoelaces were already loose, the strange knot might have formed slowly during dinner. I would not notice until trying to stand. The ordinary explanation actually becomes more plausible when I think of it that way. A crowded restaurant means more potential pranksters, but less uninterrupted time. An empty restaurant means fewer people, but more chance for my own shoes to tangle while I sat still for an extended period. I have never managed to recreate exactly what happened. That is another reason the memory stays with me. If I could take the same pair of shoes, sit at a table, cross my feet, and eventually produce the same configuration, I would feel much better. Maybe it would take only a few movements, Maybe the mystery would disappear immediately. But I never turned it into a proper experiment. By the time I was calm enough to think about it scientifically, the emotional power of the event had already become attached to the memory, and part of me did not want to recreate it. I think I was afraid of two possible outcomes. If I could reproduce the knot easily, I would have to accept that something that terrified me may have been completely mundane. That should be comforting. But when an event becomes connected to a period of intense fear, discovering it was ordinary can feel strangely destabilizing. On the other hand, if I could not reproduce it at all, that might make me more frightened. So I left it unanswered. I think there is value in doing that sometimes. Not every unexplained event needs a supernatural conclusion. Not every unexplained event needs to be forcibly explained away either. Sometimes the most accurate answer is simply that I do not know. I do not know how the shoelace got through the tab. I do not know how the bow formed. I do not know whether I had been moving my feet unconsciously. I do not know whether some detail of the knot has changed in my memory. I do know that when I stood up, my shoes were connected in a way that shocked both me and Jim. That is enough. The context involving psychosis is important because it explains why the incident affected me so severely. If I had been mentally well and feeling safe at the time, I might have reacted with curiosity. Instead, I was already frightened by thoughts I was struggling to evaluate properly. The shoelaces felt like a message. That is the part I no longer trust. Not because I distrust myself as a person, but because I understand that fear can turn uncertainty into certainty very quickly. When something strange happens, the mind asks, what caused this? If one frightening answer is already waiting, the mind grabs it. That night, my answer was a demon. Today, my answer is, I do not know how the laces became tangled that way. That is much less dramatic. It is also more honest. The event still scares me when I remember it. There is something deeply uncomfortable about an object on your own body changing position without your awareness. It creates the same kind of fear people describe when they wake to find a door open that they remember locking. Maybe there is a normal explanation. The fear comes from the gap in memory. At some point between one known state and another, something happened. You were present. You should have noticed. But you did not. That missing moment becomes larger than the event itself. I sat through an entire meal without realizing my shoes had become connected. When did it happen? At the start? While we were eating? While I was distracted talking to Jim? Was the right lace already loose when I entered the restaurant? Did I cross my ankles under the table? Did one loop catch the other? There must have been a sequence. Physical objects do not skip from one arrangement to another without some process between them. The fact that I did not observe the process does not mean there was none. That thought helps. Something happened. I simply missed it. The mystery is probably not that the laws of physics stopped working for a few minutes. The mystery is that I did not notice the small sequence of movements that led to the final knot. That is the explanation I find easiest to live with. But the memory remains vivid. The empty restaurant. Sunday night. Jim sitting with me, finishing dinner, standing up because I wanted to use the toilet before we left, then suddenly finding I could not walk. Looking down, my right shoelace running through the heel tab of my left shoe, a bow holding it there. Looking at Jim, asking if he had done it. His confusion. The immediate realization that nobody had been close enough to our table, as far as either of us knew, to tie them. Then, the much darker thought that came because of what I was already going through mentally. That thought frightened me far more than the shoelaces themselves. I am grateful that I can look at it differently now. Something unexplained happened. That does not mean the most frightening explanation was true. The event can remain strange without becoming evidence of the belief I had at the time. Maybe my laces loosened, tangled through the other shoe, and tightened into a bow like knot while I moved my feet. Maybe I absent-mindedly touched them and forgot. Maybe there is some simple mechanical sequence I still have not imagined. I would much rather leave space for those possibilities than give the incident a meaning that frightened me so badly. Still, if anyone asks me whether I have ever experienced something that seemed physically impossible, this is the first thing I think of. Not a shadow, not a voice, not an object disappearing, just two shoes beneath a restaurant table. I sat there for an entire meal with one of the oldest friends I have. Nobody came near us. Nothing unusual happened. Then I stood up and discovered that sometime during dinner, the laces from one shoe had somehow passed through the loop on the other and ended up tied in a bow. Jim did not know how it happened. Neither did I. I still do not. And although I no longer believe that not having an explanation means something demonic was responsible, I can still remember exactly how terrified I felt when I looked down and realized that whatever had tied those shoes together had apparently done it while I was still wearing them. I was staying in a cabin by a lake when this happened. We had only arrived that day. The trip had started normally. We unpacked, spent some time out on the water, relaxed around the property, and eventually settled in for the evening. That night, my family and I played cards for a while before everyone went to bed. The cabins were built on a steep slope. Because of that, the front side of our cabin sat much closer to the ground, while the back was supported by tall posts. From some of the rear windows, the ground below was probably around 20 feet down. That height became important later. At some point during the first night, I woke up. I do not remember what time it was. The cabin was completely dark, and everyone else was still asleep. What had woken me was the sound of leaves rustling outside the window. It did not immediately frighten me. We were beside a lake surrounded by trees, so there were countless normal things that could move through the leaves at night. A deer, a raccoon, some other small animal. I actually hoped it was something like that. I got up quietly and went to the window. Because the cabin was raised so high at the back, I had to look downward toward the ground. I expected to see an animal moving through the brush. Instead, I saw what looked like a person. Someone was standing below the cabin. That was immediately strange for two reasons. First, we were on private property. Second, as far as I knew, nobody else was supposed to be around that section of the property at night. But even those things were not what frightened me most. The figure did not look completely human. It was humanoid. That is the best way I can describe it. There seemed to be a head, a body, arms and legs. But something about the shape was wrong enough that I could not comfortably tell myself I was just looking at an ordinary person. The darkness made details impossible. I could not see a face. I could not make out clothing. Maybe that lack of detail was exactly why it looked wrong. A person standing in deep shadow often loses all the small features that make them recognizable as human. Shoulders become too broad or too narrow. Arms seem too long. The head becomes only a dark shape. At the time, though, I was not thinking about visual perception. I was just staring down at something I did not think should be there. For a while, it did not move. Neither did I. Then it looked up toward my window. Its head tilted slightly. That small movement scared me more than if it had simply walked away. It felt deliberate. It felt like it knew something was above it. All the lights inside the cabin were off, though, so I kept telling myself it probably could not see me. Maybe it heard movement. Maybe the rustling I had made getting out of bed carried through the wall or floor. Maybe it was not even looking directly at me. From 20 feet above, in darkness, judging exactly where someone is looking is difficult. Still, it seemed to raise its head toward my window and hold it there. I stayed very still. I did not wake my parents. I did not call out. Eventually, the figure moved away. It disappeared into the darkness around the property. I remained by the window for a while, watching the place where it had been. Nothing else happened. I eventually went back to bed, although I do not remember sleeping well. The next morning, I told my parents what I had seen. They gave me the simplest explanation. It had probably been a dream. That was not impossible. I had woken in the middle of the night. The room was dark. I may have been only partly awake. People can carry images from dreams into the real room for a few seconds after waking. A tree trunk, a shadow, or an animal could have become a person-shaped figure because my brain was still transitioning out of sleep. The slight head tilt could have been branches moving. The whole event might have lasted much less time than I remembered. I did not want to think about anything stranger, so I accepted that. Dream, problem solved. The rest of the next day was normal. We spent more time around the lake. Nothing strange happened. By evening, though, I was more nervous about going to sleep than I wanted to admit. I kept remembering the figure below the window. Still, exhaustion eventually won. I fell asleep. Sometime in the middle of the second night, I woke again. This time, there was no sound that I could identify. No leaves crunching, no footsteps, no door. I just woke up. For a while, I lay there looking outside. There was a tree close to our cabin, and I could see its leaves moving gently in the wind. Watching them gave me something normal to focus on. Then a small flicker of light passed across them. I barely reacted. My first assumption was headlights. There was a road somewhere nearby, so I thought a passing car had probably sent a beam through the trees. Then it happened again. Another flicker. Then another. The more I watched, the less that explanation seemed to fit. The road was too far away. There were too many trees between it and the cabins. A vehicle's headlights should not have been moving across that particular tree in the way I was seeing. More importantly, the light was not moving like car headlights. It seemed smaller, more controlled, like a flashlight. I sat up and tried to determine where it was coming from. That was when I realized the light was inside the cabin next to ours. There was another cabin close by. I could see a beam moving around inside it. At first, I relaxed slightly. Someone must have been in there. Maybe another relative. Maybe someone connected to the property. Maybe they had arrived late. Perhaps they were looking for something and trying not to turn on all the lights. Then I remembered something. Everyone who was supposed to be there was still in our cabin. I could see or account for my family. Nobody had gone next door. As far as we knew, the other cabin was empty. I began watching more carefully. The flashlight moved across the interior. I could only see portions of the room through windows and gaps in the darkness, so I never got a complete view of whoever was carrying it. Then I started catching glimpses of a shape moving behind the light. It reminded me immediately of the figure from the previous night. Same general impression. Humanoid, but not something I could clearly identify as a normal person. That was when my stomach dropped. The explanation that the first night had been a dream became harder to hold on to. Maybe this was a real person. If it was, that created a different kind of danger. Someone had entered an empty cabin on private property in the middle of the night. Maybe a trespasser. Maybe a thief. Maybe someone looking for a place to sleep. A real stranger would have been more likely than anything supernatural and potentially more dangerous. I kept watching. The beam moved through the cabin. I wanted to wake someone, but part of me was still trying to understand what I was seeing first. Then the flashlight turned in my direction. The beam came across the darkness and landed directly on my face through the window. For a second, everything stopped. The light was bright enough that there was no question about where it was pointed. Whoever was inside the neighboring cabin had just found me. I had been watching them. Now they knew it. The beam moved away. The figure turned. Then the light rushed toward the door. What happened next is the part I still struggle to explain. The light came out of the neighboring cabin and started moving toward ours. Fast, far faster than I expected someone to move through that terrain in darkness. From where I was watching, it looked like whoever had the flashlight was running full speed directly at our cabin. But there was no sound, no footsteps, no branches snapping, no leaves crunching, no heavy breathing. Nothing. The light just moved. It came across the space between the cabins with a speed that looked almost impossible. I remember thinking there was no way a person could move that quickly over uneven ground without making noise. Then the beam passed behind my dad's truck, which was parked just outside our cabin. I waited for it to appear on the other side. It never did. The light disappeared completely. So did the figure. I stared at the truck. Nothing moved. There was no beam underneath it. No person stepping out from behind it. No one continuing around the other side. It was as though whatever had been coming toward us had reached the truck and simply ceased to exist. That was the moment I became truly terrified. The first night could have been a dream. The figure below the cabin could have been an animal or a shadow. But now I had been awake long enough to watch a flashlight move around another building. I had seen it turn toward me. I had watched it come outside. Then it appeared to rush directly toward our cabin and vanish behind the truck. I did not know what to do. I was afraid to wake my parents because I did not even know how to explain what I had just seen. There's something with a flashlight running between the cabins sounded insane. I also did not want anyone opening the door. If there was a real person outside, I wanted that door to stay closed. So I stayed in bed. I watched the windows. I listened. Nothing happened. No one knocked. No door handle moved. No footsteps circled the cabin. The figure never appeared again. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I fell asleep. The next morning, I got up and walked past the neighboring cabin. I wanted to see whether anything had changed. That was when the situation became even stranger. There was a padlock on the door. It looked completely normal, still locked. No visible damage, nothing suggesting someone had broken in. The door itself had a spring mechanism. Whenever it was opened, it would pull itself shut. And it was not quiet. The hinges creaked loudly. When someone let go, the door slammed. I knew that because I had heard and used doors like it before. There was no way to open that thing gently without making at least some noise. Yet during the night, I had heard none of it. If a person had been inside, they would have somehow needed to get past the lock. Then, when they realized I was watching, they would have had to open a loud, spring-loaded door, run outside at full speed, cross rough ground without making a sound, then disappear behind my father's truck. I could not make that sequence work. That does not mean it was actually impossible. It means I did not understand what I had seen. There are several natural explanations I have considered. The first is that I may have been seeing reflections. Glass at night can create very strange effects. If I was looking through our window toward the other cabin, light from inside our own room, moonlight, reflections from vehicles, or even something moving behind me, could have appeared to be inside the neighboring building. But all our cabin lights were off. That limits some possibilities. Still, glass can reflect very weak light sources that are almost impossible to notice directly. A flashlight somewhere outside could reflect off one window, then another, making it seem as though the light originated inside the cabin. The beam landing on my face is harder to explain that way, but not impossible. Maybe someone elsewhere on the property was moving a light and happened to sweep across our window. The apparent figure inside the neighboring cabin could have been created by reflections and shadows. The moving beam afterward may have belonged to the same real person walking somewhere outside, not inside the cabin at all. At night, judging depth across multiple windows is extremely difficult. A light 50 yards away can appear to be inside a nearby room if the angles line up. That could also explain the locked door. Nobody had ever entered. I only thought they had. Another possibility is that the flashlight belonged to someone who had legitimate access to the cabin by another entrance. Maybe there was a second door I did not know about. A basement access point, a window, a maintenance entrance. The padlocked door I checked in the morning may not have been the only way inside. Properties with multiple cabins sometimes have keys available to caretakers, groundskeepers, or owners. A person could have unlocked and relocked it without damaging anything. The fact that I personally did not know anyone was supposed to be there does not mean absolutely nobody had permission. Maybe a property employee came by late. Maybe they were checking something. But their behavior would still be odd. Why use only a flashlight? Why rush toward our cabin after seeing me? Why vanish behind the truck? The silent movement also bothered me. Then again, sound at night can be deceptive. I was inside a building with walls and windows between me and the outside. The wind may have been moving through the leaves. The cabin itself could have blocked certain sounds. A person running on soft ground, grass, damp soil, or pine needles can be surprisingly quiet from inside. If I expected loud footsteps, their absence could feel impossible, even if they were simply too faint to hear. Distance was also difficult to judge. What looked like someone moving incredibly fast toward us might have been a light closer to me than the person holding it. A flashlight beam can sweep across the ground much faster than a human can run. If the figure turned and pointed the flashlight while moving, I might have tracked the beam rather than the body. The light could race from the cabin to the truck in a fraction of a second, while the person remained much farther away. My brain may have fused the moving beam and the figure into one object. That would make the speed seem impossible. The truck could also have blocked the beam completely. If the person changed direction while behind it, I would never see the light emerge from the other side. They might have crouched, turned off the flashlight, or walked away in darkness. From my perspective, it would look like disappearance. That is one of the strongest explanations for that part. I saw light moving. Then the truck blocked it. The light went off. I assumed the person had vanished. There is no requirement that anyone disappeared physically. I only lost visual contact. The neighboring cabin itself is still harder. If I truly saw someone moving around inside, the locked door becomes important. But perhaps I was mistaken about where the figure was. The windows could have layered reflections from trees and a person outside. At night, human vision is much less reliable than we realize. We see contrast and motion well, but detail becomes poor. The brain fills in missing information. A dark object moving behind a beam becomes a human shape. A flashlight reflected in glass becomes a person searching a room. Once I connected it to the figure from the previous night, my mind may have made the resemblance stronger. Memory after fear also changes. The first figure may not have looked exactly like the second. Years later, They become the same thing because the two events occurred on consecutive nights. That is how stories become coherent. At the time, though, I was convinced they were connected. I wondered whether the figure from beneath our cabin had gone into the empty cabin the following night. Maybe it lived somewhere around the property. Maybe it was watching us. Maybe it had been curious. Those thoughts did not help me sleep. The flashlight was especially confusing if I tried to interpret the figure as something paranormal. Why would some strange, non-human thing need a flashlight? If it could move silently and disappear, why search a cabin using an ordinary light? That detail actually makes a human explanation more likely. Someone inside was probably a person. Maybe the strange appearance came from darkness. Maybe the person had unusual clothing or posture. Maybe I was seeing them only in fragments. The first night might also have been a person, a trespasser who came onto private property after dark. Perhaps they were checking the cabins. On the first night, they stood below ours. When they realized someone might be awake, they left. The next night, they entered the neighboring cabin. Then they saw me watching and ran. That would explain the repetition without anything supernatural. It would also explain why the figures seemed to look up toward me the first night. Maybe it actually did hear me. If that is what happened, it is disturbing in a completely different way. A stranger was wandering around private cabins at night, possibly entering buildings. I almost prefer the idea of a visual mistake. The padlock argues against the trespasser, but locks are not perfect. Maybe it was not actually secured the previous night. Maybe someone had a key. Maybe there was another route inside. Maybe the lock was closed by morning by whoever had been there. I did not inspect it like a detective. I only walked past and saw that it looked normal. There could have been things I missed. The spring door also may not have been as loud from inside our cabin as I thought. During the day, standing next to it, the creak and slam were obvious. At night, from another building with closed windows, perhaps not. Wind direction, insulation, and distance all affect sound. A noise that seems impossible to miss nearby can disappear completely a short distance away. The first night figure also could have been an animal. A large deer standing upright on a slope can look surprisingly human for a second, especially if only part of the body is visible. A bear on its hind legs would look even more human. Some animals tilt their heads when listening. If the ground was uneven, legs could be hidden by brush, making proportions look strange. The rustling leaves would make sense. Then, it eventually walked away. No supernatural explanation necessary. But I remember a humanoid silhouette. That is the image that stayed with me. It did not move like a deer. It did not look obviously like a bear. Still, I was viewing it from 20 feet above through a dark window after waking suddenly. That is not a reliable observation setup. The human brain can confidently misidentify animals at night. The second night might have had nothing to do with the first. Someone with a flashlight could have been checking the neighboring cabin legitimately. The two events may have become connected only because I was already afraid. That is another possibility, I have to admit. Once I had seen a strange figure the previous night, I was waiting for something to happen. Every flicker of light mattered more. If I had not had the first experience, maybe I would have thought, oh, someone is next door, and gone back to sleep. Instead, I watched. The longer I watched, the stranger everything became. Hypervigilance changes perception. When you expect danger, your brain becomes extremely sensitive to movement. But it also produces more false alarms. A shadow is more likely to become a person. A reflection becomes a flashlight. A light moving quickly becomes something rushing at you. That does not mean nothing happened. There clearly was some light. I watched it repeatedly. The question is only what I interpreted around it. The next night was completely normal. Nothing happened for the rest of the trip. That lack of repetition is important. No more figures beneath the cabin. No more lights next door. No strange noises. Nothing followed us home. Whatever happened lasted 2 nights and ended. If something paranormal had become attached to us, I would expect more. If a trespasser had been targeting the property, maybe someone else would have reported activity. Instead, everything returned to normal. That makes coincidence and misperception easier to believe. 2 unusual nights. Then nothing. Still, I never forgot the moment the light reached my face. That was when the situation changed from something I was observing to something that seemed aware of me. Before that, I was hidden in darkness, watching someone else. Then, the beam turned and landed directly on the window where I was standing. For one instant, I had the unmistakable feeling that whatever was in the other cabin had seen me. The immediate movement afterward reinforced that. It turned. It left. Then the light came toward us. Whether it actually moved as fast as I remember is impossible to know. Fear can distort speed. A sweeping flashlight can create the illusion of movement faster than the person holding it. But in my memory, the thing did not casually walk toward our cabin. It rushed. That is why I froze instead of waking everyone. I thought I had only seconds before it reached us. Then it went behind the truck. Nothing came out. I kept waiting for a face to appear in our window, or a hand to touch the door, or footsteps on the steps. Nothing did. In some ways, that silence was worse than if it had knocked. At least a knock would give the event a physical ending. Instead, the thing disappeared from view and left me waiting for something that never happened. The morning made everything stranger rather than easier. Daylight usually destroys nighttime fear. The trees become ordinary. Distances look shorter. Shadows disappear. That happened to most of the property. Then I saw the neighboring cabin. Padlock intact. Door closed. The same heavy spring waiting to slam it shut. I remember thinking about the sequence again. Someone gets inside, moves around with a flashlight, sees me, leaves through a loud door, runs across the property without sound, disappears behind a truck. How? I had no answer. I still do not have one that explains every part perfectly. Reflections explain the apparently occupied cabin, but not how strongly I remember the figure. A real person explains the flashlight, but raises questions about the lock and silence. A dream explains the first night, but not the second, unless both experiences happen during unstable waking states. That is possible too. I woke in the middle of the night both times. Sleep-related perception can be extremely convincing. Maybe I was never as fully awake as I believed. On the second night, perhaps I moved in and out of dreaming while staring through the window. Real leaves moved outside. My brain added lights and a figure. Then I eventually fell back asleep. The locked cabin in the morning was normal because nobody had ever entered it. I find that explanation possible, but incomplete. The sequence felt too long and coherent. I remember standing up, changing my viewing angle, looking toward the road, locating the light in the other cabin, checking that my family was still asleep, watching the beam. All of that seems like sustained awareness. But false awakenings can be incredibly detailed. People dream entire routines while believing they are awake. I cannot rule it out simply because it felt real. The emotional memory is much more reliable than the visual details. I know I was terrified. I know the fear of that light rushing toward us stayed with me. Even now, that is what I remember first. Not the cabin, not the lake, not playing cards. The light. It left the neighboring cabin and came toward ours with what seemed like impossible speed. No footsteps, no door slam, no sound at all. Then my dad's truck blocked it for one moment, and it never came out the other side. I did not tell my parents about the second night. I had already told them about the first figure and accepted their dream explanation. Trying to explain the next incident sounded even worse. I barely believed myself. I knew how ridiculous the story would sound. An empty locked cabin, a flashlight, a strange humanoid figure, a silent sprint, a disappearance behind a truck. It sounded like something I had invented. So I stayed quiet. Maybe I should have told them. If a real trespasser was on the property, adults needed to know. They could have checked the cabin properly. They might have found footprints, a disturbed window, or some other sign of entry. By saying nothing, I lost any chance of getting evidence. That is one thing I regret. If there had been muddy shoe prints outside the neighboring cabin, I would have had an answer. A person had been there. If the owner confirmed nobody entered, that would make the mystery stronger. Instead, I only checked the obvious door. The rest remains unknown. The trip continued. Nothing else happened. We eventually went home. Life moved on. But I never forgot those 2 nights. I can accept that the first figure may have been a dream or an animal. I can accept that the light may have been a reflection or a person I mislocated because of the windows. I can even accept that the apparent speed was mostly the beam sweeping across the property rather than a body running. All of those explanations are reasonable. What I cannot do is reconstruct the event well enough to make the fear disappear. At the time, it felt completely real. I watched something strange beneath our cabin. The next night, I saw something moving inside a building that should have been empty. Then, it noticed me. And for a few seconds, whatever was holding that light seemed to cross the distance between us without making a single sound. Maybe there was a normal person behind all of it. Maybe I was tired enough that light, glass, trees, and memory created something far stranger than what was actually there. I hope that is true. Because what I remember is looking through that window while everyone else slept, watching a beam of light race from the neighboring cabin toward ours. I watched it pass behind my father's truck. I waited for it to appear again. It never did. And the next morning, when I walked past the other cabin, the padlock was still in place, and the spring-loaded door that should have creaked and slammed in the middle of the night was sitting exactly where it belonged, as though nobody had opened it at all. When I was 13, my parents bought a house and moved us out of the townhouse we had been living in. At the time, it was exciting. I had 2 brothers, and for us, the move felt like an upgrade in almost every possible way. We finally had a proper yard. We had more space. Most importantly, each of us got our own room. When you are 13 and have spent years sharing space with siblings, having a bedroom that belongs entirely to you feels huge. For the first little while, the house seemed perfect. Then, small things started happening. Nothing dramatic at first. The electricity was the main issue. Breakers would randomly trip. We were not plugging in new appliances. Nobody was overloading outlets with a bunch of electronics. There did not seem to be an obvious pattern. One minute, everything would be normal, and then part of the house would suddenly lose power. Someone would go to the electrical panel, reset the breaker, and everything would work again. Old houses can have electrical problems, so nobody immediately thought that was supernatural. Maybe the wiring was outdated. Maybe one circuit had too much connected to it without us realizing. Maybe one appliance was faulty. There are plenty of ordinary explanations for breakers tripping. But then other electrical things started behaving strangely. Alarm clocks would reset. Sometimes they would go off at times nobody had set. You would wake up in the middle of the night to an alarm and look at the clock, wondering why it was ringing. Other times, the display would be blinking as though the power had briefly gone out, even though nobody remembered the rest of the house losing electricity. At first, we treated all of it like an annoyance. Someone would complain about their clock. Someone else would joke that the house hated electronics. Then, the breaker would trip again. It happened often enough that eventually the weirdness stopped being surprising. That was probably the strangest part of living there. We adapted. People imagined that if something unexplained happened in their house, they would immediately move out, investigate, or call someone. Real life usually does not work that way. You still have school. Your parents still have jobs. There are bills to pay. Dinner has to be made. Laundry has to be done. If a clock goes off by itself at 2 in the morning and then behaves normally for the next 3 weeks, eventually you stop treating it as an emergency. That was more or less what happened with us. Over time, we started joking about the lady downstairs. I do not even remember exactly when that name began. There may have been other little incidents that made us feel there was a female presence in the lower part of the house, but nothing I can confidently describe now as one clear event. It was more like a family explanation that developed around all the small things. A breaker trips, the lady downstairs. An alarm goes off, the lady downstairs. Something electrical behaves strangely, must be her again. It became almost affectionate. Not exactly a ghost we were terrified of, more like an invisible member of the household who occasionally messed with the electricity. We joked because joking made the strange things easier to live with. And honestly, for most of my high school years, that was all it was. Little incidents. Nothing that forced us to believe in anything. I still think the electrical system could explain a lot. A faulty breaker can trip under conditions that are not obvious. Loose wiring can cause intermittent power loss. Older alarm clocks can behave strangely when voltage dips for only a fraction of a second. A power interruption can be so short that lights barely flicker while a digital clock resets completely. One damaged outlet or appliance can affect an entire circuit. If the house had an electrical problem nobody properly diagnosed, then years of paranormal activity could have had one very ordinary source. At 13, I did not understand any of that. I only knew the house did strange things. By the time I finished high school, I was so used to it that I barely thought about it anymore. Eventually, my parents moved to another city. My brother bought the house from them. That seemed normal enough. It had been our family home for years. He knew the place. He knew whatever problems came with it. There was no reason to think buying it would be a mistake. He and his girlfriend lived there, and eventually they had a baby boy, my nephew. Everything seemed fine. The house was still the same house. The family joke about the lady downstairs was still somewhere in the background, but it was not something anyone organized their life around. Then, when my nephew was around 2 years old, something happened that made that old joke feel very different. One night, sometime in the middle of the night, my brother and his girlfriend were asleep downstairs. Their son was supposed to be sleeping in his crib upstairs. He was only 2. At some point during the night, my brother woke up because the bedroom door opened. His little boy was standing there. That by itself was shocking. A 2-year-old appearing downstairs in the middle of the night is enough to scare any parent. My brother immediately started trying to understand how he had gotten there. The first problem was the crib. His son had somehow managed to climb up and out of it. Toddlers can do that. Some children become surprisingly good climbers very early. They figure out how to get one leg over the rail, shift their weight, and lower themselves down. It can happen before parents realize the crib is no longer containing them. So while dangerous, that part was possible. The stairs were harder. The staircase in that house was not simple. It was not one straight run from the upper floor to the lower floor. There was a 90-degree turn partway down. The steps around that turn were awkward. Even adults had to pay attention sometimes. For a 2-year-old in darkness, in the middle of the night, getting down those stairs alone would have been difficult. Not impossible. Toddlers can crawl down stairs. They can sit and lower themselves one step at a time. They can surprise you with what they are capable of when nobody is watching. But then, he had apparently made it all the way downstairs. He reached the room where his parents were sleeping, and he opened the door. My brother, confused and probably still half asleep, asked him how he had gotten down there. I can imagine the question being almost automatic. How did you get downstairs? His son answered him. The lady helped me. That was what changed everything. Not because a 2-year-old saying something strange is automatically evidence of a ghost. Children that age say strange things constantly. They mix dreams with reality. They repeat phrases they heard earlier. They invent people. They have imaginary friends. Sometimes they answer a question with whatever idea enters their head. A 2-year-old does not understand that an adult is asking for a careful, factual explanation. Still, of all the things he could have said, he said the lady helped him. And this was in the same house where, for years, our family had casually referred to some unexplained presence as the lady downstairs. That connection was hard to ignore. My brother immediately knew what the phrase meant to us. I do not know whether anyone had ever used the lady downstairs around my nephew. That is an important uncertainty. Children hear more than adults realize. Maybe someone had joked about her while he was nearby. Maybe he had heard the phrase once and remembered it. If he woke frightened at night and imagined someone helping him, his brain could have borrowed that familiar idea. If that happened, his answer was not mysterious at all. He was repeating language from the family. But if nobody had ever said it around him, then the statement becomes much harder to dismiss emotionally. A 2-year-old somehow gets out of his crib, navigates a difficult staircase in darkness, walks to his parents' room, opens the door, and when asked how he managed it, says a lady helped him. It is the kind of sentence that changes the atmosphere of a house immediately. My brother did not stay there much longer. Very shortly afterward, he moved to another house. I cannot say his decision was based entirely on that incident. There may have been other practical reasons. Families move. Children need different spaces. Money, jobs, and relationships influence those decisions. But I know the story about my nephew became part of how we remembered that house. For years, the lady downstairs had been a joke. After that night, the joke stopped being quite as funny. I have gone over the possible normal explanations many times. The first is the most obvious. My nephew climbed out of the crib by himself. Then, he descended the stairs by himself. Children are capable of more than adults think. A toddler who is determined enough can solve surprisingly complicated physical problems. Maybe he had practiced climbing when nobody was watching. Maybe he had already learned to come down the stairs safely during the day. The 90-degree turn looked dangerous to adults, but he may simply have crawled through it. At night, he may have moved slowly. There is no need to imagine him walking upright down every step like an adult. He could have sat, crawled, held the railing, used the wall. Taken several minutes. His parents were asleep, so nobody knew how long the journey took. Then he reached their bedroom and opened the door. Again, toddlers learn how doors work. Some 2-year-olds cannot manage a handle. Others absolutely can. There's nothing impossible about that part. The mystery is only his explanation. The lady helped me. Maybe he dreamed about a woman. Children often wake from dreams without completely understanding where the dream ended. If he dreamed that a woman helped him leave the crib, he may have carried that story into waking life. Perhaps he woke halfway through the process. Maybe he dreamed the entire trip downstairs and then actually climbed out and followed the route. The dream and the physical event could blend into one memory. Adults do something similar after vivid dreams. A child would have even less ability to separate them. Another possibility is that the lady was not supernatural at all. Maybe he meant his mother. At 2, language is still developing. Perhaps his mother had helped him down the stairs on another occasion, and he was describing that memory instead of what happened that night. Maybe there was another woman he associated with being carried or guided. A grandmother, relative, babysitter, someone from television. When my brother asked a question, the boy gave an answer that made sense only inside his own toddler logic. Adults then connected it to the family ghost story. That could easily happen. There is also a possibility that someone actually was awake and helped him without remembering clearly. People can perform surprisingly complicated actions while partially asleep. A parent might wake, hear the child, guide him somewhere, then return to bed with little or no memory. Sleepwalking and confused nighttime awakenings can happen. I do not know whether anyone in the house was prone to that. It is only another possible explanation. But according to the story as I know it, both parents believed they had been asleep until their son opened the bedroom door. The child seemed to have arrived on his own. That is why the statement stayed with everyone. The electrical incidents from my teenage years also looked different afterward. For years, we had attributed them jokingly to a woman. But why a woman? That question bothers me, because I cannot remember whether there was ever a clear reason. Maybe someone in the family had once thought they heard a woman. Maybe there was a story connected to the house that I have forgotten. Maybe we simply chose a female identity at random. If we had jokingly called the presence the man downstairs, and years later my nephew said a lady helped him, there would be less connection. The fact that both were female makes the coincidence feel significant. But coincidence is not evidence. Family stories influence language. If the lady downstairs was part of the household vocabulary for years, there is a strong chance the phrase survived into my brother's household. Maybe someone said it when a breaker tripped while the toddler was nearby. Looks like the lady downstairs is at it again. Adults forget that children are listening. A 2-year-old might not understand the joke, but could remember the concept. Then one night, after a difficult journey downstairs, he is asked how he did it. The lady helped me. Everyone gets chills. But the idea had already been planted. That is probably the most reasonable explanation if the phrase was ever used around him. The problem is that nobody remembers teaching him about her. That does not mean nobody did. Memory of casual conversation is poor. People do not remember every joke made in front of a toddler. The phrase could have been said once months earlier and forgotten by every adult in the room. The child could still retain it. Children surprise adults like that all the time. There is another detail that makes the story emotionally complicated. If there really had been some unseen presence in the house, the incident with my nephew did not sound threatening. According to him, the lady helped. She did not frighten him. She did not hurt him. He was not crying when he appeared downstairs, at least not in the story as it was told to me. He simply arrived and explained that someone had assisted him. That creates a very different image from the usual haunted house story. If the lady existed, maybe she had watched over the house. Maybe the electrical problems were not attacks at all. Maybe she was just there, The paranormal interpretation becomes almost protective. A toddler escapes his crib, which is dangerous. He reaches a staircase where he could easily fall. Some presence guides him safely down. Then he finds his parents. That version is comforting in one sense. It is also deeply unsettling. Because if something invisible was close enough to help a child down the stairs, then it had apparently been close to us for years. Maybe while we slept. Maybe while we walked around the house. Maybe all those little electrical disturbances were the only indication. Again, that is a story built around the unexplained pieces. I cannot prove any of it. And I think it is important not to turn a toddler's sentence into proof of a spirit. Young children do not communicate with adult precision. Their statements are shaped by dreams, imagination, memory, and whatever words they have available. Adults then interpret those statements through our own expectations. My family already had a story about a lady. So naturally, we heard his sentence as confirmation. Another family might have heard the same words and assumed he dreamed about a babysitter. Context changes meaning. What I find interesting is that the house's earlier activity was mostly electrical. There were no constant apparitions. No one was being attacked. No furniture moved across rooms. Breakers popped. Alarm clocks reset. Alarms went off. Things that could very plausibly come from wiring problems. If there really was a paranormal presence, it was remarkably subtle. That makes the normal explanation stronger. An electrician probably could have found something wrong in the system. Loose connections, worn breakers, overloaded circuits, voltage fluctuations. Those problems might have persisted for years if nobody had them properly investigated. A brief drop in voltage could reset alarm clocks without causing an obvious full house blackout. Some clock models also have alarm functions that can be accidentally switched. Teenagers bump buttons. Power interruptions change settings. The more people living in a house, the more opportunities for someone to accidentally alter something and forget. What felt like a pattern may have been a collection of normal household glitches. We called it the lady downstairs because that was more entertaining than saying the electrical system was unreliable. The nickname then survived longer than the individual incidents. Years later, one toddler sentence gave the old joke a completely new meaning. That may be the entire story, and yet I understand why my brother moved. Even if you know all those explanations, your child changes how you evaluate risk. When it is only you hearing an alarm clock turn on by itself, you laugh. When your 2-year-old appears downstairs in the middle of the night after navigating a dangerous staircase and says someone helped him, you stop laughing. You do not need to believe in ghosts to decide you want a different house. The physical danger alone is enough. A toddler who can climb out of a crib and access stairs requires immediate changes. A new bed, gates, locks, more supervision. Moving may have solved several problems at once, but emotionally, I know the lady was part of it. The house no longer felt like something we could dismiss as easily. I have wondered what would have happened if my brother had asked follow-up questions. What lady? What did she look like? Where did she go? Maybe he did. I do not know. But asking a 2-year-old detailed questions can also shape the answer. Children are suggestible. If an adult reacts strongly, the child realizes they have said something important. Then they may add details because they think that is what the adult wants. So perhaps it is better that the statement remained simple. The lady helped me. Nothing more. No description. No old-fashioned clothing. No dead woman's name. No dramatic ghost story. Just one sentence. In some ways, the simplicity makes it more effective. It is difficult to explain away because there is so little to analyze. He did not say he saw a glowing woman floating down the stairs. He said someone helped him. That is exactly the kind of thing a 2-year-old might say about a real person. Except there was apparently no real person there. I sometimes think about the possibility that he never walked the entire staircase alone. If he fell at any point, the outcome could have been terrible. The turn in the stairs was awkward. A child his age could easily lose balance. Yet he arrived safely. That is the part family members naturally focus on when they want to believe the lady was friendly. Maybe something really did protect him. Or maybe he crawled carefully, because toddlers instinctively lower themselves when they are unsure. Children can be surprisingly cautious around stairs when they are not being rushed. He may have taken 10 minutes to get down. There is nothing impossible about a careful toddler making it safely. His parents only saw the result, not the process. The missing process creates the mystery. That is similar to the electrical problems. We saw the breaker after it tripped, not the exact electrical fault that caused it. We saw the clock reset, not the moment the voltage dipped. We saw the toddler downstairs, not the journey from the crib. Whenever the cause is invisible, the imagination has room to work. The lady became our explanation for invisible causes. Maybe that is all she ever was. A name for things we did not see happening. Still, family stories often become powerful because multiple generations contribute to them. My brothers and I grew up in the house joking about an unseen woman. Years later, the next generation was barely old enough to speak when one of them used almost the same idea. That gives the story weight. I do not know what my nephew remembers now. Probably nothing. Most people retain very few clear memories from age 2. If you asked him as an adult, he might know the story only because the family told it to him later. His original experience, whatever it was, may be completely gone. That means we will never get his independent adult interpretation. We cannot ask whether he remembers a woman. We cannot ask whether she carried him, held his hand, walked in front of him, or whether he was simply repeating a phrase. The opportunity disappeared as he grew older. Maybe that is why the story remains so clean in my head. There is no later explanation. My brother did not catch someone hiding in the house. There was no babysitter who admitted helping. Nobody found an obvious reason for the statement. He moved. The house passed out of our daily lives, and whatever small, strange things happened there stayed behind. I do not know whether the people who lived there afterward experienced anything. It would be interesting to know if the breakers continued tripping. If they did, that would strongly suggest an electrical problem. If they hired an electrician and discovered faulty wiring, maybe years of our family ghost stories could be explained in an afternoon. I would honestly be fine with that. A natural explanation does not make the memories less real. We still experienced the confusion. We still laughed about the lady downstairs. My brother still woke to find his 2-year-old standing at the bedroom door. The emotional impact does not depend on a ghost being real. On the other hand, if later occupants independently spoke about a woman downstairs without knowing our story, that would make me uncomfortable. But I have no such evidence. So I leave the house where it belongs, unexplained rather than proven haunted. What I know is that when I was 13, we moved into a house where small electrical disturbances became normal enough that my family eventually gave them a nickname, the lady downstairs. For years, she was a joke, something we blamed when a breaker popped or an alarm clock behaved strangely. We grew up. My parents left. My brother bought the house and started raising his own family there. Then one night, his 2-year-old son somehow climbed out of a crib, made his way down a staircase with a difficult 90-degree turn, reached his parents' room, and opened the door. My brother woke up and asked the obvious question. How did you get down here? There are dozens of things a toddler could have said. I walked. I climbed. I don't know. No answer at all. Instead, he gave the one answer that brought years of family jokes back into the room. The lady helped me. Maybe someone had mentioned her around him. Maybe he dreamed about a woman. Maybe he was talking about somebody else entirely. Maybe the staircase was easier for him than everyone imagined. Those explanations are all reasonable. But my brother did not own that house for very long after that. And whenever I think about the lady downstairs now, I do not think about tripped breakers or alarm clocks anymore. I think about a 2-year-old standing in a doorway in the middle of the night after somehow making it safely through a dark house, telling his father that he had not come down those stairs by himself. Forgive me for stepping in for just a moment. If you've only recently found your way here, then welcome. I'm glad you came. If these stories are keeping you company tonight, consider subscribing to Crowvane Manor. New stories arrive here often, the kind that stay with you long after the night is over. And if you tap the bell, you won't have to go looking. The next one will find you on its own. Thank you for being here. Now, let's return to where we left off. If you've stayed with me this far, then these stories didn't simply pass the time. They stayed with you. Everything you heard tonight was real. Real people. Real moments. And in each one, something quietly slipped out of place. If you'd like more of the kind that don't let go so easily, subscribe to Crowvane Manor. There are more rooms left open, and more stories waiting behind every door. I'm grateful you spent this part of your night here. Rest well, and I'll be waiting when you return. I was about 12 years old when this happened. There was a mirror attached to the back of my bedroom door. It was not a huge decorative mirror or anything especially unusual. It was just one of those mirrors you keep on a bedroom door so you can look at yourself before leaving the room. I had lived with it there long enough that I never thought of it as creepy. It was just part of the room. One night, it was around 11:30 p.m., and I was still awake. My dad and my brother were both downstairs. They were the only other people home with me. For some reason that I honestly do not remember anymore, my bedroom door was locked. Maybe I wanted privacy. Maybe my brother had been bothering me earlier. Maybe I had just locked it without thinking. Whatever the reason, I remember that the door was definitely locked. I was on FaceTime with a friend. That detail became important because it meant I was not completely alone when the strange part happened. My friend could not see the whole room, obviously, but he could hear what was happening through the phone. We were just talking normally. Nothing creepy had been happening before that. I was not watching horror videos. We were not discussing ghosts. I was not trying to scare myself. Then I noticed the doorknob. It started turning. At first, I assumed it was my brother. That was the obvious explanation. If my door was locked, maybe he had come upstairs and was trying to get in. He could have been messing with me. Brothers do things like that. I did not immediately panic. I just watched the knob move. But something about it felt wrong. I could not hear anyone outside. No footsteps coming up the stairs. No voice. No laughing. Just the handle moving against the locked door. Then the mirror started shaking. Not a small vibration. Not a little rattle, because the door moved slightly. It started shaking violently. The whole thing seemed to rattle against the door as though someone were grabbing or striking it. I froze. The sound was loud enough that my friend heard it through FaceTime. That is the part I always come back to. If I had been completely alone, I might eventually convince myself I had exaggerated the sound. Maybe it was less violent than I remember. Maybe I was half asleep. Maybe I imagined part of it because I was scared. But my friend immediately reacted too. He asked what was happening. I was staring at the mirror and door, completely freaked out. Then he told me to get out of the room. Basically, run out the fucking door. I remember how ridiculous that sounded because the thing frightening me was happening at the door itself. But staying inside felt worse. The doorknob had moved. The mirror was shaking. I had no idea what was on the other side. Eventually, fear turned into the need to get somewhere with other people. I unlocked the door and ran out. I expected to find my brother outside. Part of me was almost hoping he would be there laughing. I wanted the whole thing to be a prank. But the hallway was empty. I went downstairs. My brother was there. So was my dad. Neither of them had been outside my bedroom door. At least, that was what they said, and from where they were downstairs, it did not look like either of them had just run back before I came out. That was when the whole thing became much more frightening. If my brother had been responsible, the story would be over. He turns the handle, shakes the door enough to make the mirror rattle, then admits it. But both people who could realistically have been on the other side of the door were still downstairs. I told them what happened. My brother did not believe me. I do not remember my dad making a huge deal about it either. From their point of view, I was a 12-year-old who had gotten scared in my bedroom late at night. There had to be some normal explanation, and there probably was. At the time, though, I wanted an explanation immediately. Later, I searched online trying to figure out why a mirror would suddenly shake on its own. That was a mistake. Instead of getting useful information about loose mirror mounts, door vibration, air pressure, or building movement, I found creepy stories. There were posts about mirrors shaking before paranormal events, stories about demons, stories about things coming through mirrors. Probably every possible horror story the internet could give a frightened 12-year-old. Once I read that stuff, the incident became 10 times worse in my head. Before the search, I had a physical mystery. A door handle moved. A mirror shook. After the search, I was imagining demons coming through mirrors. That is one of the worst things you can do when you are already scared. The internet will always give you an explanation that matches your worst fear if you search long enough. I told my brother about what I had found. He still did not believe any of it. Honestly, that was probably good. If he had acted terrified too, I might have become even more convinced something supernatural had happened. Years later, I can think about the event more calmly. The first thing I would look at now is the mirror itself. Mirrors attached to doors can shake for surprisingly ordinary reasons. If the mirror was hanging from hooks or brackets rather than being fixed tightly to the door, even a small movement could make it rattle dramatically. A door does not need to swing several inches. Tiny vibrations can travel through it. If the doorknob was turned while the latch was still engaged, the movement could twist the door slightly inside its frame. That could make a loosely mounted mirror shake. So the moving handle and shaking mirror may not have been two separate events. One could have caused the other. The real question then becomes what moved the handle. There are several possibilities. The first is still my brother. Even though he was downstairs when I came out, I cannot prove he never came upstairs. He could have gone up quietly, tried the handle, shaken the door, then run back downstairs before I unlocked it. At 12, I may have taken longer to react than I remember. Fear changes time. What feels like 5 seconds can be 20 or 30. If I froze while talking to my friend, then hesitated before opening the door, that could have given someone plenty of time to get downstairs. I do not remember hearing footsteps. but a person deliberately trying to prank me could move quietly. And if my brother enjoyed messing with me, he might deny it afterward just to keep the prank alive. That is possible. But I remember going downstairs quickly enough that it did not feel like he had time. I also remember his reaction seeming genuinely confused. That is why I never fully accepted the prank explanation. Another possibility is the latch or handle itself. Door handles contain springs and moving metal parts. If something inside the mechanism was loose or under tension, the handle could shift on its own. A partially engaged latch can move when pressure changes between rooms. If the door was slightly warped, it might press against the frame. The handle could rotate a little as the latch slipped against the strike plate. At night, when you are staring directly at it, even a small movement looks intentional. If the handle moved enough to disturb the door, the mirror could start rattling. The whole sequence might have come from one mechanical problem. Old or cheap door hardware can behave strangely. A loose spindle inside the knob can create movement. A latch spring can fail. The weight of the handle itself can make it drop slightly. If my door was locked, the locking mechanism may also have changed how the handle moved under pressure. I did not examine any of that afterward. I was 12. I was not going to take apart the doorknob and study it. I ran downstairs because I thought something was trying to get into my room. Air pressure is another possible explanation. If someone downstairs opened or closed an exterior door, it could create a pressure change through the house. Heating or air conditioning systems can do the same thing. A bedroom door that is almost perfectly fitted into its frame can respond to sudden pressure. The door may flex or move against the latch. If the mirror was loose, it could shake. Would that actually turn the doorknob? Probably not in the way a human hand would. But again, I do not know how far it rotated. I remember it turning. Maybe it only shifted. Maybe the entire door moved and made the handle appear to rotate from my angle. Memory often simplifies things. At 12, the story became the doorknob turned by itself. The actual motion may have been smaller. There could also have been vibration through the house, a washing machine, plumbing, a heavy truck outside, someone moving downstairs, something striking a wall. Houses transfer vibration in strange ways. If the mirror was attached loosely, it might amplify a tiny vibration into a loud rattle. The same vibration could move a loose handle. The fact that I did not notice any other shaking does not rule that out. Different objects resonate at different frequencies. A mirror can rattle while a desk beside it looks completely still. If the brackets holding it were slightly loose, it might have been especially sensitive. That would also explain why the sound seemed so violent. A lightweight object striking repeatedly against a hard door can make a lot of noise without moving very far. My friend hearing the noise through FaceTime supports the fact that something physical happened. It does not tell us what caused it. That distinction is important. I did not imagine the sound completely if someone else heard it. But he did not see the door. He could not tell whether the mirror was moving because of a person, a loose mounting, or something else. He only heard a frightening noise and heard me panicking. His reaction probably made my fear stronger. When someone on the phone says, "Get out of there," you stop trying to find rational explanations. You leave. There's also the possibility that someone else was in the house. That is not where my mind went at the time, because I knew only my dad and brother were home. But if a stranger had somehow entered, that would be more serious than anything paranormal. Still, I saw no sign of an intruder. No one was found upstairs. Nothing was stolen. No doors or windows were reported open. No one tried the bedroom again. So I do not think that is likely. The event was brief and never turned into anything larger. That matters. If something had truly been trying to enter my room, I might expect the handle to keep moving, maybe knocking, maybe footsteps, something after I ran downstairs. Instead, once I left the room, everything stopped. That makes a temporary mechanical cause much easier to believe. The mirror itself may have been the key. A door-mounted mirror changes the balance of a door. Depending on how it is attached, it can vibrate when the door flexes. If the screws or clips gradually loosened, there might be one night when the movement became especially noticeable. Maybe the mirror had already been rattling slightly for weeks, and I had never noticed because I was not sitting there in silence at 11:30 at night. Then one night, the handle shifted and the whole mirror reacted. Because I was already looking at the door, I caught the entire thing. That could be all. What made it feel supernatural was the sequence. Handle turns. Mirror shakes violently. No person outside. That looks intentional. Human beings are wired to interpret movement as agency. When a handle turns, we automatically imagine a hand. When a mirror shakes, we imagine someone shaking it. It is difficult to look at those actions and think about springs, pressure, and vibration, especially when you are 12. My brain immediately went to someone as outside my door. When nobody was there, it moved to something as outside my door. Then the internet supplied Demon. That progression is understandable, but each step involved adding information I did not actually have. All I really knew was that the handle moved and the mirror shook. That is still strange. It just is not proof of what caused it. I have also wondered whether the door was actually locked the whole time. I remember it being locked because I had to unlock it before running out. That seems pretty clear. But if the lock was the simple type built into a bedroom handle, someone could still turn the outside knob even though the latch would not retract. So a person trying the door would produce exactly what I saw. The handle moves. The door stays closed. The mirror rattles because they push or pull. Again, that points back toward my brother as one of the simplest explanations. If he came upstairs, tried the door hard enough to shake it, and ran, the entire event becomes ordinary. My friend would hear the noise. I would panic. My brother would deny it. That is a very believable sibling prank. I cannot rule it out. But if that is what happened, he has never admitted it. At least not that I remember. And I still have the strong memory of finding both him and my dad downstairs, behaving like they had been there the whole time. Maybe that memory is exactly why the story survived. If he had confessed years later, I probably would not think about it anymore. Without a confession, the question remains. The online search definitely made the event worse than it needed to be. Once I read stories about haunted mirrors and demons, I started thinking differently about the object itself. Before, it was just a mirror attached to my door. Afterward, it became something I did not completely trust. Every reflection in low light seemed more noticeable. I probably avoided staring into it at night. That is how suggestion works. If someone tells you mirrors are portals, or that something can appear behind you, you start checking. Then ordinary visual effects become terrifying. A shadow in a reflection. Clothes behind you. Movement from a television. Your own face looking unfamiliar in dim light. There is a real phenomenon where staring at faces in mirrors under low light can make features appear distorted. That has nothing to do with demons. Human visual perception adapts and fills in missing information. But if you already believe a mirror is dangerous, those distortions feel supernatural. I was lucky my experience stopped with the shaking. I never saw anything come out of it. Nothing appeared in the reflection. No figures stood behind me. The horror stories I found online were just stories. They were not evidence connected to what happened in my bedroom. At 12, though, I did not understand the difference between someone else wrote about something scary involving a mirror, and this explains my mirror. Similarity feels like evidence when you are frightened. It is not. If you search for any strange event online, you will find people connecting it to paranormal things. Lights flickering, doors opening, animals staring at walls, mirrors moving, phones ringing, dreams, anything the internet did not solve my mystery. It just gave my fear a shape. Even now, though, I cannot completely explain the timing. I was looking toward the door. The knob moved. Then the mirror violently rattled. My friend heard it. I opened the door. No one was there. I checked downstairs. The only two other people in the house were there. That is why the memory has stayed. It had enough physical reality to stop me from dismissing it as imagination, but not enough evidence to tell me what actually happened. I think the most likely possibilities are mechanical, loose mirror hardware, a door under pressure, a faulty handle. Maybe someone downstairs closed another door hard enough to create vibration. Or my brother really did sneak upstairs and has simply never admitted it. All of those are more likely than a demon coming through a mirror. But the emotional part of the memory does not care much about probability. It remembers being 12. It remembers an ordinary bedroom becoming unsafe in a few seconds. It remembers the feeling of watching a handle move when nobody was supposed to be outside. It remembers the mirror suddenly rattling hard enough for a friend on FaceTime to hear it. And it remembers the moment after I ran downstairs and saw my dad and brother sitting there. That was when I realized I did not have an answer. Years later, I wish I had inspected the door immediately in daylight. I would check the hinges, the lock, the latch, the mirror brackets. I would push on the door from different angles. I would turn the handle slowly. I would see how much movement was needed to make the mirror shake. I suspect I might recreate the entire event. Maybe simply pulling down on the handle would cause enough vibration. Maybe the mystery would disappear in 10 minutes. But that is not what happened. I searched online instead, and because I was a scared 12-year-old, I found the worst explanations first, so the memory became attached to demons instead of hardware. I can see that now. That does not mean I know exactly what happened. I do not. Maybe the doorknob really did move because someone touched it. Maybe my brother played a prank. Maybe there was a vibration I never identified. Maybe some small defect in the door created a sequence that looked far more deliberate than it really was. There are plenty of possibilities. What I do not think anymore is that searching Shaking Mirror and finding a story about a demon proves anything. If something supernatural happened, the internet did not establish it. And if something ordinary happened, being frightened prevented me from investigating it properly. That is probably why the incident is still unresolved in my mind. It happened quickly. I ran. Nothing happened again. No evidence remained. But whenever I remember it, I can still picture that door. The room was quiet. My friend was on FaceTime. My dad and brother were downstairs. The bedroom door was locked. Then, without anyone saying a word from the hallway, the handle started turning. A second later, the mirror attached to that same door began shaking hard enough that someone miles away through my phone could hear it. I ran downstairs expecting to find the person responsible. Both possible suspects were already there. Maybe there is a simple explanation involving a bad lock, a loose mirror, and an old door. I genuinely hope that is all it was. Because what scared me most was never the stuff I found online afterward. It was the few seconds before I opened the door. When I was sitting in my room, listening to that mirror slam against the wood, and realizing that whatever seemed to be turning the handle was on the other side of a door I knew I had locked. I was standing near the Grand Canyon when this happened. I do not remember exactly how old I was, but it was years ago, and I was there with my family. We had stopped at one of the viewpoints, and like most people seeing the Grand Canyon in person, I was completely absorbed by it. Pictures do not really prepare you for the scale. You can look at photographs, watch videos, read measurements, and understand intellectually that it is enormous. But standing beside it feels completely different. There is so much distance in front of you that your brain almost struggles to make sense of it. The cliffs look close until you realize how far away they actually are. The shadows make certain sections look flat, even though there are huge drops between them. Everything seems both massive and strangely quiet. I remember standing there and thinking about nature, geology, time, science, and all the other random things that go through your head when you are looking at something that has existed for far longer than any human civilization. I was not thinking about ghosts. I was not looking for anything supernatural. I was not even paying much attention to the tourists around me. I was just staring out over the canyon. My family had been standing near me when we arrived, but while I was looking at the view, they gradually moved away. I did not notice. That was not unusual. There were lots of people around, and I was distracted. I probably assumed everyone was still relatively close. I stood there for several minutes. Then I heard my name. Not shouted, not called from across the viewpoint. It was spoken softly, and the voice sounded like my grandmother. That is the part that has stayed with me. The voice did not sound distant. It sounded as though someone were standing right beside me, close enough that they did not need to raise their voice. Just my name. Softly, clearly, I immediately turned around. My first thought was that my grandmother had walked up beside me. There was no fear yet. Nothing about hearing a familiar family member say your name is frightening. I looked to one side. Nobody. I looked to the other. Still nobody. Then I started searching the crowd. It took me a few seconds to find my family. My grandmother was around 50 feet away. There were dozens of tourists between us. That was when I became confused. She was not looking like someone who had just spoken to me. She was standing with the rest of the family. And more importantly, the distance made the voice I had heard seem impossible. If she had shouted my name loudly, maybe I could believe it. Sound travels. People hear each other through crowds all the time. But that was not what I heard. The voice had been quiet, almost conversational. It sounded like someone beside my shoulder saying my name just loudly enough for me to notice. There was no way, I thought, that my grandmother could speak that softly from 50 feet away and somehow have her voice reach me clearly through dozens of people. I walked over to her. I asked if she had called my name. She said no. I asked the rest of my family. Nobody had. That was the moment the experience became strange. Until then, I had assumed there was an obvious explanation. My grandmother had called me. End of story. But she had not. At least, she said she had not. I remember looking back toward where I had been standing. There were plenty of strangers around. Maybe one of them had said a name that sounded like mine. That is one of the simplest explanations. Tourist areas are full of people calling to children, friends, spouses, and relatives. If someone nearby had a similar name, I could easily have thought they were speaking to me. Maybe their voice happened to sound a little like my grandmother's. That would explain everything. But my memory is that the voice was extremely clear. It did not sound like a similar name. It sounded like my name. And it did not merely sound like some random woman. It sounded familiar. That is why I turned around, expecting to see my grandmother standing there. Still, familiarity can be deceptive. Human brains are very good at matching incomplete sounds to familiar voices. If you hear a few syllables in a noisy place, your brain does not process them like a recording. It fills in missing pieces. If somebody nearby said something close to my name in a tone remotely similar to my grandmother, my brain might have immediately completed the pattern. That happens with sounds all the time. You think your phone rang when it did not. You hear someone call your name in a crowded room, then realize nobody was speaking to you. Sometimes you hear a familiar voice in the sound of a television in another room. The brain is constantly trying to find meaningful patterns in noise. Names are especially powerful because we are trained from childhood to respond to them immediately. So maybe someone said something similar. Maybe I heard only part of it. My brain supplied the rest. That is probably one of the most reasonable explanations. But the apparent closeness of the voice still bothers me. It sounded as though it came from right next to me. The Grand Canyon is a strange environment for sound. There are cliffs, rock walls, open spaces, crowds, wind, and uneven terrain. Sound can travel in ways that are difficult to judge. A voice from farther away might reflect or be carried by wind. Someone positioned at the right angle could sound closer than they actually were. I do not know enough about the acoustics of that exact viewpoint to say what was possible. Maybe my grandmother really did say something without remembering. Maybe she spoke my name casually while talking with another family member. The wind or rock formations carried it toward me. By the time I asked her, she did not remember saying it because it had not been intentional. People say names during conversation without thinking about it. If she had said, "Where'd it go?" in a normal voice, perhaps I heard only my name and nothing around it. But again, my memory is that it sounded like a direct call. Just my name. Softly, close, that could be memory simplifying the event. Years later, the experience becomes cleaner. Maybe the original sound included more noise around it. Maybe it did not sound quite as close as I remember. Memory preserves the strange part and removes everything that did not matter. What remains is the voice. That is normal. But it also makes the event impossible to investigate now. I cannot return to the exact second and hear it again. I cannot measure where everyone was standing. I cannot ask the people around me whether one of them had a child with the same name. I cannot know the wind direction. All I have is the memory. At the time, I did not know about any stories involving voices calling people near the Grand Canyon. That is important to me. Years later, I heard or read stories about a woman supposedly calling children by name to lure them toward the canyon. I do not remember the exact legend now. I do not remember where I heard it. I do not know how old the story is or whether it was actually connected to the same area where I had been standing. And I definitely did not know about it at the time of my experience. That later folklore made the memory much creepier. If I had heard the legend before visiting, it would be easy to say suggestion influenced me. Maybe I would have been expecting to hear a voice. Maybe a random sound would have become the woman from the story. But I did not have that expectation. As far as I remember, I learned about those stories afterward. That does not mean the legend explains what happened. It only means that years later I encountered a story that resembled my experience. That kind of coincidence can feel powerful. It can also change the way you remember something. Once I heard the legend, the voice at the canyon was no longer just an unexplained familiar sound. Now, it fit a larger story. A woman calls a child. The child follows. Something bad happens. I started wondering whether the voice I heard had been trying to make me move. That is a much darker interpretation. But when I think carefully, the voice did not tell me to come closer. It did not say, "Come here." It did not repeat my name. It did not call from the edge. I did not feel pulled anywhere. I simply heard my name once, so I cannot honestly say anything was trying to lure me. That idea comes from the folklore I learned later, not from the event itself. At the time, I only turned around looking for my grandmother. That distinction matters. If I had been standing somewhere dangerous, and the voice had come from over the edge or from an isolated trail, maybe I would feel differently. But I was at a public viewpoint with tourists around. My family was nearby. There were plenty of normal human voices. The environment already contained almost everything needed to explain what happened, without anything paranormal. Still, there was something eerie about realizing how separated I had become from my family without noticing. I had been standing there, absorbed in the canyon. Then, I heard a familiar voice. When I turned around, the person I expected to see was not there. For a few seconds, I was alone in a crowd. That feeling probably contributed to how strongly I remember it. There is something strange about being surrounded by people while suddenly realizing none of the people you know are beside you. The canyon itself adds to that. It is beautiful, but there is also a physical danger that is impossible to ignore. You are standing near an enormous drop. Even at a safe viewpoint, part of your brain understands that one careless movement in the wrong place can have serious consequences. That awareness creates tension whether you notice it consciously or not. Maybe hearing my name simply triggered the alert part of my brain. Someone calls you. You turn. You look for your group. You realize they have moved. Nothing supernatural. Just a moment of disorientation in a dramatic place. But the voice still sounded like my grandmother. I have tried imagining whether another tourist could have sounded similar. Of course they could. There are millions of people with similar voices. We recognize family members partly through expectation. If I believed my grandmother was somewhere behind me, then any older female voice calling a similar name might be interpreted as hers. I was not expecting a stranger. I was expecting family. So my brain chose the familiar match. This happens even on phones. Sometimes someone says a few words and you are certain it is one person, only to discover it is someone else. Voices are distinctive, but not unique enough that mistakes never happen. In a noisy outdoor environment, the chance of misidentification increases. Another possibility is that the sound did not come from another person at all. Wind can create strangely voice-like sounds when it moves around structures, railings, trees, clothing, or rock. A short burst of sound can resemble a syllable. If my name was short enough, random sound could potentially mimic it. That explanation feels less likely because I remember actual speech. But people hear words in noise constantly. Fans, running water, engines, static. The more familiar the word, the easier it is for the brain to recognize it where it does not exist. Your own name is probably one of the strongest possible patterns. Maybe the canyon, wind, and crowd noise created something that sounded close enough. My brain did the rest. I have also considered whether I was briefly daydreaming. I had been standing still for several minutes, deeply focused on the view and my own thoughts. There are moments when your attention turns inward so strongly that outside sounds and thoughts blend together. Maybe I imagined my grandmother calling me, not in the sense of consciously inventing it, more like an auditory thought becoming vivid enough to feel external for a second. People occasionally think they heard someone call them when nobody did. This can happen without anything being wrong with them. The brain can generate a very brief, familiar sound at the edge of attention, especially when distracted or tired. If that was what happened, it would explain why the voice sounded exactly like someone I knew. My mind already knew her voice. It would not need an external sound source to imitate it. But the memory feels external. It seemed to come from beside me. Again, that is exactly why it scared me later. The experience was not like thinking about my grandmother. It was like hearing her. The fact that I immediately looked around is evidence that I interpreted it as real sound in the moment. But it is not evidence that there was actually a speaker beside me. Brains can mislocate sound. Even completely real sounds can seem to come from the wrong direction. Echoes and reflections are especially good at doing this. At a place like the Grand Canyon, that seems worth considering. A voice might travel from behind, reflect off something, and seem to come from the side. Or a nearby tourist might have spoken while facing away, making the source difficult to identify. We are used to locating sound in enclosed rooms where reflections are predictable. Huge outdoor spaces are different. Wind can also carry high-frequency speech unevenly. A voice that should fade with distance can occasionally travel farther than expected. Could my grandmother have said my name softly enough that only I noticed? I still think 50 feet through a crowd seems unlikely. But unlikely and impossible are different. Maybe she was closer when she spoke and moved by the time I found her. I remember seeing her about 50 feet away after looking around for a few seconds. How long did I search? 5 seconds? 10? 20? I do not know. Could she have been 20 feet away when I heard her and then continued walking? Maybe, probably not enough to explain all the distance, but memory of spacing is not precise. At large tourist sites, people move constantly. A group can cover distance quickly without it feeling obvious. The crowd could also have distorted my sense of where she had been. Maybe I assumed she had been 50 feet away the whole time, simply because that is where I found her. That is another reasonable possibility. I asked her whether she had called me, and she said no. I believe her. But people forget small actions. She could have said my name without meaning to get my attention. Maybe another relative said it. Everyone denied it, but perhaps they honestly did not remember. It had been one word, no reason to store the moment. For me, it became important because I had heard it from a strange location. For them, it might have been nothing. I sometimes wonder whether somebody in the tourist crowd heard me asking my family about it and realized they had been the one who said the name. Maybe they had a relative with the same name. They would have had no reason to come explain it to me. From their perspective, they had simply called someone in their own group. This may have been the entire mystery. 2 people at the Grand Canyon had the same name. One person called softly. I heard it. Because the voice was female and familiar sounding, I assumed it was my grandmother. That explanation is almost too ordinary. But ordinary coincidences happen constantly in crowded places. We only remember the ones that line up perfectly with something personal. If the stranger had called a completely different name, I would not remember the sound at all. The fact that I later heard folklore about a woman calling children makes the coincidence feel more important than it may be. This is something I try to keep in mind. Stories spread because they are memorable. If a place has cliffs, danger, missing person stories, and generations of visitors, eventually legends develop around voices, apparitions, warnings, and people being called away from safety. The Grand Canyon is exactly the kind of place where folklore would thrive. Huge landscapes make people feel small. Sound behaves strangely. Weather changes quickly. People get separated. Accidents happen. Once enough stories circulate, unexplained personal experiences get attached to them. That does not mean the folklore caused my experience or explains it. And because I do not remember the exact story I heard later, I would not want to claim there is one specific legend that matches what happened to me. I only remember hearing variations of the idea that a woman calls children by name near the canyon. That was enough to make me think back. The most disturbing version of the memory is easy to imagine. I am standing too close to the canyon. My family moves away. Something notices I am separated. It uses my grandmother's voice. It says my name softly, close enough to make me turn. Maybe if I had followed the voice instead of looking for my actual family, something would have happened. That makes a good, scary story. It also adds several things that did not happen. I was not led anywhere. I did not see a woman. The voice did not repeat. Nothing approached me. Nobody disappeared. I heard one word. I turned around. Then I found my family. That is the full event. The lack of anything afterward makes a normal explanation much easier to believe. If some entity was trying to lure me, it gave up immediately. If a person was intentionally trying to frighten me, they never revealed themselves. If something paranormal was nearby, it did nothing else. The experience lasted seconds. That is why I do not tell the story as proof of anything supernatural. It is simply something I have never been able to explain with certainty. I think that is enough. Not every strange event needs to become a ghost story. Sometimes a mystery is more interesting when you admit the limits of what you know. I know I heard my name, or at least I experienced hearing it. I know the voice sounded like my grandmother. I know it seemed to come from very close beside me. I know my grandmother was nowhere near close enough, in my judgment, to have spoken that softly and been heard so clearly. I know she denied calling me. So did everyone else in the family. Those are the details I trust. Everything beyond that is interpretation. Maybe it was another tourist. Maybe the canyon carried a distant voice strangely. Maybe my grandmother said something and forgot. Maybe I misjudged how far away she had been. Maybe the sound was an auditory illusion produced by wind and crowd noise. Maybe I experienced a brief internal voice while distracted. Those explanations are all more grounded than assuming something unknown deliberately copied my grandmother. But none of them gives me the satisfying moment where I can say, that was definitely it. I think that is why the memory still returns. If another tourist had stepped forward and said, "Sorry, I was calling my daughter," the story would have disappeared from my life. If my grandmother had laughed and said, "Yes, I called you before walking over here," same thing. Instead, I looked for the obvious source and did not find one. Then, years later, I heard stories that sounded uncomfortably similar. That gave the memory a second life. I also wonder whether the location itself makes people remember strange experiences more strongly. If I had heard my name in a supermarket and nobody admitted calling me, I might have shrugged and continued shopping. At the Grand Canyon, everything already feels larger than normal. The landscape is ancient. The distances are extreme. The environment overwhelms ordinary scale. A small, unexplained event there takes on a different feeling. You are standing beside something that makes you aware of how little control humans actually have. Then, a familiar voice comes from nowhere. Of course, you remember it. I remember looking at my grandmother afterward and trying to judge whether she was joking. She was not. Nobody seemed concerned. To them, nothing had happened. The entire mystery existed only for me. That almost made it stranger. I wanted someone else to say they heard it. Nobody did. If another family member had turned at the same moment, then I would know there was an external sound. Without that second witness, even the existence of the voice outside my own perception remains uncertain. It felt real, But feeling real and being externally produced are not always the same thing. That is something I have become more comfortable admitting over the years. Human perception is impressive, but not perfect. We mishear lyrics. We think someone called our name. We recognize faces that are not there. We misjudge distance. We remember emotional moments more clearly than ordinary details. Most of the time, those errors mean nothing. Once in a while, they happen in exactly the right combination to create something unforgettable. Maybe that is what happened beside the canyon. A familiar-sounding stranger, an echo, a gust of wind, my own distracted mind. Then I turned, saw my grandmother far away, and the ordinary explanation became harder to accept. I still do not know, and honestly, I am fine saying that. What bothers me is not that I think some supernatural woman definitely called me. I do not. What bothers me is how certain I was in that first second about what I heard. There was no hesitation. I did not think. Did someone say something? I heard my name. I heard it in a voice I associated with my grandmother. I turned because I expected her to be standing almost shoulder to shoulder with me. Instead, there was empty space. Then, tourists. Then, much farther away, my actual family. I walked over and asked the one question that should have ended the mystery. Did you say my name? My grandmother said no. So did everyone else. Years passed before I heard any of the stories about voices calling children near the canyon, and I still do not know how much truth there is behind those stories. Maybe they are only folklore. Maybe I later remembered them differently because they resembled my experience. I would not use them as evidence. But I cannot stop them from making the memory more unsettling. Because I was standing there, alone, without realizing my family had moved away. I was looking out over one of the deepest landscapes I had ever seen. And then, from what sounded like only a few inches beside me, someone used my grandmother's voice to say my name. I turned immediately. Nobody was there. My grandmother was 50 feet away, and she swore she had never called me. If you've stayed with me this far, then these stories didn't simply pass the time. They stayed with you. Everything you heard tonight was real. Real people. Real moments. And in each one, something quietly slipped out of place. If you'd like more of the kind that don't let go so easily, subscribe to Crowvane Manor. There are more rooms left open, and more stories waiting behind every door. I'm grateful you spent this part of your night here. Rest well, and I'll be waiting when you return.